Why do we have two narratives among the Jews? There are Jews who are talking about the homeland, and there are Jews who are speaking against it. What connection do they have with the Palestinians?
As a Jewish person, I'm not an exception. I'm not trying to say that I'm so much better than anybody else. To be Jewish, you don't have to be Zionist. Zionism was against the Jewish religion.
Dr. Abraham, could you explain or define what Zionism actually is? And then, who are the Ashkenazi Jews?
A segment of the Jewish people who became a nation in Europe, a nationality called Ashkenazim. My first language is Yiddish. Very few Jewish people speak this language anymore because the Zionists tried to destroy our language because they only wanted Hebrew to be the language of the state.
I just wanted to clarify this point here, and please correct me if I'm wrong. Zionism is actually those people who believe in the state of Israel, right? And it's not necessary that they're Jews. They can be Christians as well, as you just said, right?
You can begin with that, yes.
All right.
But there's much more to it than that.
A very important part of your life spent in the direct activism with the Palestinian people on ground. What are the on-ground realities in terms of what the daily people face over there?
We were maintaining the unity and the revolt of the Palestinians against the occupation, even though we were so weak. But it was working anyway.
How have they been able to lobby in somewhere like Canada and the US? They don't have academic freedom.
The authorities who have the power are susceptible to being pressured by the Zionists because they're afraid of being criticized for being anti-Semitic.
آپ لوگوں نے ڈسکشن سنی ڈاکٹر ابراہیم وائسفیلڈ کی، اور میں چاہ رہا ہوں کہ ہم اس پہ تھوڑا سا خاص طور پہ حماس بھائی آپ کی اس میں انشاءاللہ کچھ تبصرہ لینا چاہ رہا ہوں.
میں ایک ایسے گروپ میں تھا جس میں میں ریسرچ کرنا چاہ رہا تھا، دیکھنا چاہ رہا تھا اسرائیل کے بارے میں. میں نے آن لائن انٹریکٹ کیا فیس بک پہ، تو مجھے لوگوں نے کچھ رسپونڈ کیا کہ یہاں پر ایسے لوگ بھی ہیں جو کہ یہودی ہیں لیکن وہ فلسطین کے حق میں بولتے ہیں اور اسرائیل کو وہ نہیں مانتے.
اوبویسلی اگر ہم اس کو آبجیکٹیولی دیکھیں گے تو ہم شاید کہیں گے کہ زائنسٹ جو ہے وہ زیادہ برا ہے، کیونکہ جو اس کا آئیڈیا ہے وہ گراؤنڈ ریالٹیز میں ظلم میں کریٹ ہوتا ہے.
اچھا، میں اس بارے میں نا ڈاکٹر سے تھوڑا سا ڈس ایگری کروں گا. ڈاکٹر از سیمنگ اے لٹل مور آپٹمسٹک، ٹھیک ہے. آئی ڈونٹ نو وائی، لیکن مجھے یہ چیزیں ابھی اس طرح نظر نہیں آ رہی. مجھے لگ رہا ہے کہ ابھی بھی ان کے پاس زیادہ پاور ہے، ابھی بھی ان کے پاس زیادہ انفلوئنس ہے. اب اس کے دو آؤٹ کم ہو سکتے ہیں، آئدر ڈیزاسٹرس ہوگا کیونکہ وہ وار فیئر والا، یا پھر یہ ہوگا کہ پھر ایک آدھ ان کو گیو ان کرنا پڑے گا انٹرنیشنل پریشر کے ہاں، اور وہ ایک سائڈ پہ لے.
السلام علیکم ورحمۃ اللہ وبرکاتہ اینڈ ویلکم ٹو دا شو. آج کا جو ہمارا سیشن ہے اٹس گوئنگ ٹو بی اباؤٹ زائنزم، اینڈ آج ہم بات کریں گے آج کل کے موجودہ حالات کے تناظر میں زائنزم کے حوالے سے. زائنزم کیا ہے، اور زائنسٹ کون لوگ ہیں، اور اسرائیل اسٹیٹ کا زائنسٹ کے ساتھ کیا تعلق ہے، اور جیوز کا تعلق زائنزم کے ساتھ کیا ہے. کیا جیوز اور زائنسٹ ایک جیسے لوگ ہیں، یہ ان دونوں میں فرق ہے، اور کیا کچھ ایسے جیوز بھی ایگزسٹ کرتے ہیں جو کہ اسرائیل کے خلاف بولنے والے ہیں اور فلسطینیوں کے حق میں بولتے ہیں. تو اس حوالے سے آج ہماری ڈسکشن ہوگی. میرے ساتھ جو میرے پینلسٹ ہیں ان میں ایز یوزول بردر احمد خان، بردر حماس اشرف، اور اسی طریقے سے آج ہم ایک انٹرنیشنل گیسٹ کو بھی آن بورڈ لیں گے، کینیڈین ایک ایکیڈیمک ڈاکٹر ابراہیم وائسفیلڈ. اور اس سے پہلے کہ ہم ڈاکٹر ابراہیم وائسفیلڈ کو آن لائن لیں اور ان سے ڈسکشن کریں، میں تھوڑا سا بریف انٹروڈکشن ان کا کروانا چاہتا ہوں. ڈاکٹر ابراہیم وائسفیلڈ جو ہیں یہ بیسکلی اینٹی زائنسٹ موومنٹ کے ون آف دی، یعنی آپ سمجھ لیں کرٹیک کی وجہ سے مشہور ہیں. اور ان کی جو فیملی ہے، ہی از ایکچولی فرام دا فیملی جس میں ان کے ہولوکاسٹ سروائیورس کی فیملی میں سے ہیں، اور ان کی خاص طور پہ ہی از این آتھر آف کورس، ایک پاپولر اکیڈیمک ہیں اس حوالے سے، اور انہوں نے نیومرس انٹرنیشنل کانفرنسز میں ریسرچ پیپرز پڑھے ہیں اور بہت سے پروٹیسٹ کیے ہیں پیلسٹینینس کے حق میں، اور اینٹی زائنسٹ جو ہیں خاص طور پہ ان کے حوالے سے ان کا کافی زیادہ کام ہے. بہت سی جو ہیں فورمز ہیں ان کا یہ پارٹ ہے، ان میں والنٹیئر کرتے رہتے ہیں. اسی طریقے سے آن دا گراؤنڈ انہوں نے بہت زیادہ، ہی ہیز اے ہسٹری آف لائک مور دین 50 ایئرس آن دا فیلڈ، جہاں پہ انہوں نے آن دا گراؤنڈ جا کے کام کیا، وہاں پہ پیلسٹین اور جو ہیں مسلمانوں کے حق میں انہوں نے آواز اٹھائی. اور آبویسلی زائنسٹ جو موومنٹ ہے اس کے خلاف انہوں نے بہت سا کام کیا. ان کی پی ایچ ڈی کا تھیسس بھی اسی موضوع پر ہے. ایک پولیٹیکل سائنٹسٹ ہیں. سو انشاءاللہ we'll take him on board right now and we'll have a discussion with him on the topic of Zionism. So, Dr. Abraham, welcome to the show today. I would like to, for our audience, to give a brief introduction of yourself, especially things that are, the work that you're doing right now, and currently, especially talking about the anti-Zionism, for example. What is the popular narrative that you have regarding the anti-Zionism? Thank you.
I began to be active in solidarity with the Palestinian people since an early age. In 1968, we first started to demonstrate against the occupation of the West Bank because we knew that the Zionist governments, were lying and that they intended to maintain an occupation of as much territory as possible. And therefore, we began to protest against this. And I was perhaps the first Jewish person in North America to speak in solidarity at a Palestinian demonstration in 1968. Since then, I've organized a civil society Jewish movement against Zionism. And also during the war in Lebanon in 1982 to 85, I worked with the ambassador to Canada, Dr. Abdullah, to fight against the war. And I think that our efforts, did have some impact. And the documentary study that I wrote on the massacre of Sabre in Lebanon was published after, and is now a reference book on what happened during General Sharon of Israel and his occupation of Lebanon and his collaboration with phalangists in organizing the massacre of Sabre of 3,000 Palestinians, in 3 days. Incredible.
All right, Dr. Abraham, it's really nice to see your effort and the way you're doing. Now, I would like to start our conversation with a very basic question, and this is a question that I'm actually, this is a common question that we have among Muslims, especially if you're talking about my community in Pakistan here. Whenever we talk about the Jewish people, or the Jews, you can say, it's really strange for us to know that there are people, and there is a significant number of people who are actually against the state of Israel, and they're speaking in the favor of Palestinians to some extent, especially the Muslims and the atrocities that are being, currently carried out against the Palestinians. So there is a question, a very valid question, I think, that what is the reason behind this? Why do we have two narratives among the Jews, where there are Jews who are talking about the homeland, especially Israel, and there are Jews who are speaking against it? So what is the reason? Why are they speaking against this? I mean, what connection do they have with the Palestinians? Is it just because they speak against the oppression, or are there religious reasons or anything else? So this is a very common question that we have. So I would like to know what your thoughts are about this, please.
Yes. As a Jewish person, I'm not an exception. I'm not trying to say that I'm so much better than anybody else. I'm just saying that there is a Jewish anti-Zionist tradition, which I learned from my mother, because she was a Jewish Bundist who escaped from the Warsaw Ghetto under the Nazi occupation.
All right.
And she taught me that to be Jewish, you don't have to be Zionist. In fact, and my father, who was very religious, taught me that Zionism was against the Jewish religion, because Judaism teaches Jewish people to be pacifist, to be in favor of peace, and not to be in favor of war. And my mother taught me that the Jewish Bundist movement that she was active in was a movement for the liberation of the Jewish people, but refused to accept Zionism as a way to liberate the Jewish people. Because, as is known, the Jewish people in Europe were very oppressed. And in fact, most of my parents' families were killed in the Holocaust. Right. That's all true. But at that time, the reason why the Jewish people were living in Europe is because, like my parents who were Polish, they considered Poland to be their homeland. They considered themselves to be Polish. They didn't want to be leave their own homeland or be kicked out in their own homeland, by some fascists. So they stayed and they fought, and eventually they won, but at a terrible cost. So, the origin of the Jewish people is not in the land of what was Canaan at that time. The origin of the Jewish people was in the Sinai. with Moses, and he was not even a king. He was like he was like a liberator, a national liberator, and the way they organized themselves at that time was in national assemblies, and there were 35 such national assemblies in the Sinai of the people with delegates from each of the tribes, etc. So this actual original structure of the Jewish people was as a religion and as a people, but not as a land, not as a state, and not as a kingdom. So Zionism has taken some of the worst aspects of Jewish history and turned it into a dogma, an ideology, which is very dangerous because it places the interests of one group above that of any other group. And that includes the interests of the Ashkenazim above that of the Mizrahim, who are treated as a lower caste, and includes the Ashkenazim continuing control of the...
Dr. Abraham, sorry to cut you off, but for our audience, could you explain or define in as shorter words as you can what Zionism actually is? And then, who are the Ashkenazi Jews?
Ashkenazi, the European Jews. Ashkenazi in Hebrew means German. So, there's a segment of the Jewish people who became a nation in Europe, a nationality called Ashkenazim, and developed around the river Ruhr, where German was adopted as a daily language, and became a dialect called Yiddish. So my first language is Yiddish. And very few Jewish people speak this language anymore because the Zionists tried to destroy our language because they only wanted Hebrew to be the language of the state. And so they wouldn't tolerate any other language, neither Yiddish nor Ladino of the Spanish Jewish population that merged with the Mizrahim, or Arabic. No other language was allowed by the Zionism. Zionism was a philosophy that was developed by the Christian Protestant movement, which wanted to expel the Jewish people from their countries because they wanted to make a Christian nation state. They wanted to expel the Jews of Europe to Palestine to make a colony for one empire or the other. Either Oliver Cromwell from the English Empire or Napoleon for the French Empire wanted to do the same thing. But the Jewish people always resisted. They always refused to do so because they wanted to remain in their homeland where they were living, of course. But now the Zionists have had and still do have control over a large part of the Jewish people because the Jewish Bundist movement, of which my mother was a member of, was the strongest movement at that time. And they, in the last Jewish municipal elections in Warsaw, the Jewish Bund won 17 out of 20 seats. The Zionists represented 8% of the Jewish people at that time. But after the Holocaust, all of those anti-Zionists, were lost because they were also socialists generally, and the Nazis sought to kill as many such Jewish socialists as possible because they were a counter-revolutionary movement that tried to destroy what the Russian people had accomplished to some extent. And on top of it all, the dictator of Russia at that time, Stalin and his supporters, they took our leaders and put them into prison and they died. So we were attacked by both sides. And we lost the leadership of the Jewish people. But now, slowly, by a spontaneous generation of the younger generation of Jewish Americans in particular, we are rebuilding a Jewish anti-Zionist movement. And now we have various chapters of the Jewish Bundist movement that are organized now at this.
Dr. Weizfeld, thank you for the detail. I just wanted to clarify this point here, and please correct me if I'm wrong. What I've understood from your words is that, in your opinion, Zionism is actually a movement that seeks to establish a state, whereas the Jewish religion, in your opinion, does not believe in the state. Rather, they believe that the Jews, they need to live where they're actually in their homelands, wherever they are. For example, if they're living in America, this is their homeland, they have to live there. So they don't need to establish a state, and Zionism is actually a movement that seeks to actually colonize, a type of colonize the Jews in Palestine, and restrict them or bound them to a certain place. Is that correct? Is that what you just said?
You can begin with that, yes.
All right.
But there's much more to it than that.
Oh yeah, definitely. So Zionism is actually those people who believe in the establishment of the state, in the state of Israel, right? And it's not necessary that they're Jews. They can be Christians as well, as you just said, right? It's not necessary that they're Jews.
Yes and no. I mean, the ideology of Zionism insists that Jewish people actually move into the state there and become, its loyal subjects and send their children into the military.
Right.
But Zionism arose, and at the end of the Holocaust, it started off for the reason that they got the support of the Jewish refugees who had nowhere else to go in the world, because like my parents were in a Jewish refugee camp after the war. And because my father had a sister already living in Canada who was a citizen, she was able to sponsor my parents so that they could immigrate with a visa into Canada. But 48% of the Jewish refugees did not have relatives elsewhere who could sponsor them. So they couldn't get a visa to go into Canada, the United States, etc. And these countries, they didn't want to help Jewish refugees settled elsewhere. They couldn't care less about the Jewish people. In fact, they didn't do anything to stop the Holocaust. And these are the supposed allies. Now the allies of Israel were the ones who allowed the Holocaust to take place, or who carried out the Holocaust. It's such an irony. So, Zionism only succeeded because of the imposition of Occidental, Western Christian nation-state control over the world. And so Jewish refugees ended up going to Palestine because they had nowhere else to go. Then the Jewish Arabs, the Mizrahim, came into Israel because they had suffered some discrimination and some attacks in revenge, for what the Zionists had done to the Palestinians, even though they were not responsible. And so they ended up leaving, thinking that it was going to be a better life. And so they went to Palestine, and they formed 70% of the Jewish Israeli population at that time. That's, 70% were Jewish Arabic. Then the Russian Jewish population came, 2 million, came and because they couldn't, because they had always, been discriminated against, even in supposedly liberated countries such as the USSR. And so they wanted to leave because there was some, for example, in 1968 in Poland, all of a sudden there was a campaign against all the Jewish people because they were all supposed to be Zionists, because Zionism was supposed to represent the Jewish people. So the Communist Party adopted the definition of the Jewish people by Zionism. And they didn't, whereas before, Jewish people were supposed to be liberated by the communist regime, but it wasn't the case. And so even the Jewish anti-Zionists were expelled from Poland. It's so sad.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Weizfeld. And I think what I've understood from your explanation is that you said that majority of the Jews, why they moved to Israel, even though they did not perhaps believe in the state of Israel, they were not Zionists, but they did move because they were discriminated. There were other reasons for that. Is that correct? All right. So what about the Zionists? I mean,
let me add. The problem is that their children were indoctrinated by the Zionist educational system.
All right. So in other words, now their children are in fact more influenced by Zionism. So my question is, Dr. Hare, how did Zionism gain such an influence? Of course, the political influence that they were able to establish the state. What were actually the reasons? I mean, how were they able to influence such a kind of global? They had an influence on the global politics, for example. So I mean, how did they play? It appears that from your views, it appears that they were very few people out there. But how did they get such an influence and such a power that they could, establish a state, and the whole world, actually all the Jews, they actually had some way, one way or the other, they had to follow and they had to move to that state?
Okay. The power of Zionism does not come from the Jewish people internally. The power of Zionism came, first of all, from England with the Balfour Declaration.
Right.
Then France supplied Israel with a nuclear reactor. Then the United States came in and became the main backer, for Zionism, and are financing it militarily for $3.8 billion a year to buy American military goods. So the link between Israel and the military-industrial complex of the United States is very close. And in fact, Israel is an agent of the dominant, Western superpower, the United States of America. So if one goes back, to 1917, with the British occupation at that time, which took over a portion of the Ottoman Empire, and France took over another portion. Well, General Allenby, he walked into Jerusalem and said, "This is the last crusade," as if the Crusaders had won, and we'll have won for all eternity in perpetuity, And then it was transferred over to the control of the Zionists because they couldn't maintain the control themselves because of a dual resistance movement. The Palestinians were against the British occupation, and the Zionists were also fighting against the British occupation, which was trying to compromise with the Arab population. So when the Zionists, were transferred the authority by the British occupation and even supported militarily at the time. And this is where they get their, the power from, but not necessarily from the Jewish people. Look, a majority of the Jewish people don't even live in the Zionist state.
Right.
Even the Americans, there are more Jewish Americans than there are Jewish Israelis, because they don't want to go to live in the Zionist state. They want to stay in the United States of America. That is their homeland. They consider themselves to be Americans, which is good, but they also consider themselves to be Jewish. It's like a dual identity. It doesn't fit into the ordinary liberal, bourgeois nation state, paradigm. That doesn't work anymore. But that is the paradigm that is imposed upon the Jewish people by the powers that be to form the Zionist state. And then, the children are indoctrinated and they go and they kill Palestinians because they think that they're Nazis. And, the paranoia of the anti-Semitic heritage of the West and of Europe in particular is dropped on the heads of the Palestinians, who are not responsible for the treatment of the Jewish people. Now, let me say as well that there's comparisons made between the Zionist state and the South Africa state in respect to, let's say, apartheid or to any other colonial settler project. Israel is similar to the colonial settler projects, but the difference is this is much more complicated because the Jewish people were originally an oppressed nation as well. Although, and whereas in the other case, like South Africa, the Boers and the white, domination of South Africa was not by a people who were themselves dominated. So the difference is that Zionism took advantage of the discrimination and the murderous history of the West against the Jewish people. They used this to form a state because there was no alternative for so many Jewish people. So I'm not trying to excuse, what the Zionists have done. I'm just saying they took advantage of the condition of the Jewish people.
Yeah, thank you, Doctor. One more thing that you just mentioned about of course, the apartheid and all these, the oppression, of course, the occupation, for example, and how Zionists are actually, taking control and they're making use of the oppressed Jews, for example, Jewish people. My question is then, well, if this is the Jewish people, this is not the Jewish narrative, the popular Jewish narrative, as you're just, reiterating, I think. What do you actually see about the current situation, for example, or even the past? Like, for example, we had the first Intifada, then we had the second Intifada in response to, for example, the Jewish occupation. Let me talk about the Zionist occupation, I should say. So, yeah. So how do you see these things? What about the Jewish narrative? Do these Jewish people also see the Palestinians as oppressed, being victimized by the Zionists? And is it the common narrative, or is it just the Muslim narrative? Because we see that there are a lot of people who are protesting with the Palestinians, but do they also believe and see the oppression of the Muslims, and do they acknowledge and realize that this is exactly what was happening before with the Jews as well, and now it's not being done with the Palestinians?
The Jewish Israeli population, if we want to focus on them to see what their attitude is, we can see by the polls that 43% of the Jewish Israeli population are against the occupation.
All right.
So basically they're anti-Zionist, but they're living there. So there is a very substantial, very strong opposition to the Zionist occupation of at least a part of Palestine. So, and amongst the Jewish Americans, a majority, like more than 60%, are opposed to the occupation. So there is a great opposition to them, to what the Zionists are doing in Palestine. However, the Jewish bourgeoisie, except for Soros, the one exception, the Jewish bourgeoisie supports the Zionist nation state, and they finance the whole civil society structure of the Jewish Americans and Jewish Canadians, etc. So that all the communal organizations are dominated by Zionists because they have control over the finances of the community. So the Canadian Jewish Congress was actually dissolved because it had a critical position of the Israeli government. And it was replaced by a Zionist organization. So the Zionist control over the Jewish community outside of Israel is very strong as well. And this is the problem. And we have to build up new organizations and set up a new civil society in order to oppose Zionism. So we have a big task before us, and we are in effect carrying out a Jewish revolution against Zionism, not only in Palestine, but elsewhere as well.
So, all right. So this is what I've actually understood from your discussion is, and your explanation is, that there are people who are actually starting kind of a revolution against it, but because the Zionists, they control the infrastructure and of course the economies. Of course, there are certain there are ways they can influence even the normal people. So, but my question is that of course the Muslims, they do not much differentiate between the Jewish people, the Jewish community that you're actually representing, and at the same time, they do not differentiate between the Zionists. For them, Jewish people are equal. They are equally responsible because they're living there, and actually they are being benefited by that. And the Zionists, even though they're controlling, but at the same time, they're being benefited by that, and so they don't much differentiate between them. So the reason why I'm asking is this, because I want you to actually clarify your stance on the Palestinian response, and the Palestinian, for example, their revolution. Like first, I mentioned, for example, the first or the second Intifada. What do you understand by that? Do you support that? Do the Jewish people believe in that, and they say that they have the right to actually speak up and take the rights that they deserve?
Yes, the Palestinian people have a right of self-defense, right of autodetermination or self-determination. They have the right to be independent. They have the right to be free. Hurra Palestini, we say. So, but the object of the revolt, of the revolution of the Palestinians in the Intifada, is the state and not the people. This is a revolution against the domination of the Zionist state. It is not a revolution. It is not a struggle. It is not an opposition against the Jewish Israelis themselves, because as we now know, 43% are opposed to the occupation. So the first Intifada was 20 years after the 1967 occupation of the West Bank. That's why the first Intifada took place in 1987, because the occupation was continuing and there was no international opposition to the occupation. So the Palestinian people took it up upon themselves in order to stop the occupation. Now, the second Intifada in 2001 was because of the increasing strength of the Palestinians in Lebanon with the leadership of Yasser Arafat, who incidentally I met in 1980. I'm perhaps the first Jewish person to have met and spoken with Yasser Arafat.
Right. Nice.
Because he knew, he was informed about the work that I was doing in Toronto when we had a Jewish opposition organization. And it was a first encounter. It wasn't very successful, actually, but nonetheless, we continued to work together. Yasser Arafat was a difficult man to work with, but nonetheless, we worked together, and I was invited to work as a chargé d'affaires diplomat with the Palestine embassy in Ottawa in 1982, when we had to stop the invasion of Lebanon at that time. So there is an increasing Jewish opposition to Zionism everywhere. Also, inside, the 48 territories of Palestine, there was just this week, there was a demonstration of both Jewish Israeli and Palestinian Israeli who were demonstrating against the continuing militarization of the state. Israel is like a Sparta state. In ancient Sparta, all the children were raised to wage war. And that was it. That was their reason to exist. And that was their national identity. They're very pathetic. This is, what the Zionists bring to bear and impose upon the Jewish people after such a long tradition of a rich cultural and religious experience. And the Zionists come along and they try to destroy that all and turn, the Jewish people into some sort of a Spartan people. This we reject. We cannot accept such a assimilation into a Western nation state, militarism and colonialism. No, this is not the Jewish people. This is just Zionism, and we will defeat it.
Thank you, Doctor. I think Hamas has a few questions to talk about. Yeah.
Yes, Doctor. Doctor, thank you for coming into the show, and I appreciate your discussion with us very much. A very important part of your life is spent in the direct activism with the Palestinian people on ground, right? So I want you to tell us some of the any story you have in regards to what you faced with the opposition, especially on-ground realities. What are the on-ground realities in terms of what the daily people face over there in their lands, in their farms, in their homes, right?
Of course, it's real, especially in Gaza. But the opposition, the Palestinian resistance, and also the international opposition, which comes to support the popular resistance committees, which I participated with. We would go out to demonstrations, like on Land Day in particular, and the soldiers would be there to stop us from demonstrating because we were maintaining the unity and the revolt of the Palestinians against the occupation, even though we were so weak. But it was working anyway, because we were the voice of the Palestinian people, even though we were small. And the soldiers, they would come, but they wouldn't shoot live bullets because we were there. The international solidarity volunteers were there. And I would, for sure, go up to the soldiers and I would speak to them in Yiddish and let them know that I was Jewish, to let them know that they were not fighting on behalf of the Jewish people. And I would tell them exactly what they were doing. I would tell them that they were fighting on behalf of, the United States of America, basically. One time I was surrounded by the soldiers and I said, "Where does that gun that you are carrying come from?" And they would say, "Oh, United States." Say, "Ah, you see, you are an American agent. Do you realize this?"
Yes.
And, I would try to sort of, in a subversive way, educate, the soldiers so they would know. But even I was, when I was doing videos, as a journalist, even I was shot with a rubber-coated bullet in the leg because I kicked a canister of gas away from me. And so this was enough for some officer to authorize some soldiers to shoot me with a rubber-coated bullet. He hit me in the leg. And, I was in shock, but I didn't realize it. And it caused me to have a fall 2 days later. And another time, again, at the Ofer prison, when we were demonstrating against the administrative detention of a social worker, Moftar. So we went there, and I was, again, shouting at the soldiers, in Yiddish. And this one soldier came out of the prison with a grenade, a special kind of grenade, a gas grenade, a rubber ball that bounced. But this one had an exploding head. and he threw it right at me. I was videoing it, and the top exploded, and the top, hit me in the chest. So they don't care. The Zionists don't care if you're Jewish. For them, the only thing that's important is that you're a Zionist. And they will even attack a Jewish person. See, that's such a big difference between being a Zionist and being Jewish.
So, Professor, Dr. Weizfeld, so what we have understood from that is that the Zionists, actually, they don't care, they don't differentiate whether you're Jewish or whether you're Muslim, whether you're Arab or whether you're American, whatever it is, as long as you're not a Zionist, it's just like either you're with us or against us. It's just like that same theory that they're actually working on with it. Okay, the last question that I would actually bring forward to you is what do you see where this Zionism is going? I mean, what is their future? Because we see they don't have any, boundaries defined. We see that occupation is increasing day by day. We see that, they're increasing their borderlines and whatever. So what is the future of the Zionism? What is your analysis as a political scientist, for example? How do you see things going on? Yeah.
Without opposition, the Zionists could get much worse. For instance, because there are no internationals there in Palestine right now, during this recent, upsurge of demonstrations, 17 Palestinians were killed in the West Bank.
Right.
But if we were there, they would not have been killed. So they will try to get away with whatever they can get away with. They will kill, they will do anything in order to build up the power of the state if there is no opposition. With our opposition, though, it's an entirely different picture. Because, first of all, the Jewish Israelis are mobilizing now against the Zionist state. Here, the opposition of the Jewish movement to the new generation is becoming a majority mainstream movement. And we are taking on the Zionist leadership of the Jewish community, and we will defeat them.
Right.
So the prospects are good for the opposition. And I will go back to Palestine, as I have lived there, for a number of years, half the year at each time, every year. And I will go back to work with the Popular Resistance Committees and the association in Nablus, where I live, called the Tanweer Palestinian Cultural Enlightenment Forum. And there's an excellent group of people there who are working to build up the Palestinian civil society. And they do more than even the government does.
Doctor, I just wanted to ask you, whilst I was listening to your story, it reminded me of Professor Norman Finkelstein. He was also inspired by his mother into activism. But we see that with him as an academic, he suffered because of his views. In the world of academia, people started to write against him. He had a lot of trouble. So did you face something similar in your profession?
Yes, I was a professor at the York University in Toronto before I went to work for the Palestine Embassy because of the war of 1982. I was teaching the political economy of Canada-US relations and teaching also a course in political theory. But after I worked at the Palestine Embassy, I was never able to get any teaching again.
Okay.
So I was boycotted, from teaching. And even to finish my PhD thesis, it was very difficult. I had to go to another university in Montreal, Quebec, and work in French here.
Okay.
So, and then after my thesis was accepted by the department, the university administration tried to expel my thesis, and I had to go to court, and I won, and got my PhD accreditation. But it was very difficult. So your question is very pertinent.
So what do you think? How have they been able to establish such a pressure? How have they been able to lobby in somewhere like Canada and the US, where academics they don't have academic freedom?
Yes.
How have they been able to manage this?
The authorities who have the power are susceptible to being pressured by the Zionists because they're afraid of being criticized for being anti-Semitic. Okay. And most likely they are,
Yes.
And but the Zionists give them a cover, and so they don't want to, lose that cover of their position and be accused of anti-Semitism, and so they will do whatever the Zionists, tell them to do, because they think, that's the only way to protect themselves from being charged with anti-Semitism.
So do you think that this label of anti-Semitism is used to sort of cover the truth maybe, or let people not speak up when they have to?
Sometimes, but other times it's true.
Of course.
There's been attacks against the Jewish people, especially from the white supremacist movement in the United States, which have attacked synagogues, just like, Goldstein, who went into the Ibrahimi Mosque and killed 27 worshippers.
Yes.
We even had a condition recently in 2019 in which 5 of our members were killed in a synagogue in Phoenix, Arizona, together with a number of other people, because they were celebrating a marriage in a synagogue in a region that is even the police are infiltrated by the neo-Nazis there in Phoenix, Arizona, in Phoenix and in Glendale, another police department as well. And they killed our members, and this they can get away with. And because the police didn't report it to the media doesn't want to believe it either. It's very difficult, condition here for Jewish people,
okay,
who are not Zionists, because we're not protected by the Zionist establishment. We are left alone to be killed by neo-Nazis, and the Zionists don't even care. So this is the condition, the real on the ground, condition of Jewish people.
Okay. So, Doctor, I wanted to ask you about Gaza as well. Have you ever been there? And if you have, what is the situation like on the ground? And how do you think? What does the future look like with regards to the people of Gaza? And just in another question, I'll add to it because it's relevant, and then inshallah you can answer both questions. I remember in 2008, end of 2008 and beginning of 2009, Israel had the Operation Cast Lead on Gaza. And I remember following that operation, and it was much, they did much more damage than they did this time around. Such that, Norman Finkelstein wrote a book called This Time We Went Too Far. How do you see the events of 2008 and then in 2021? How do you think it's changed, or how is it similar? Has it become worse, or is it becoming difficult for Israel to, keep on this assault?
You're right. Israel is having more difficulty politically to be able to continue to batter the Palestinian people whenever they are opposed by even the most minimal use of force. And they will disproportionately attack the Palestinians in return. General Sharon, he used to have a ratio. For any of his own losses, he would take 100 Palestinian lives or Lebanese lives in exchange, he didn't care if he was losing his own people.
He was called the butcher of. He's got a title as well. Is that true?
Yes, the butcher of Palestine.
Yes, the butcher of Palestine.
Yes, so he would take 100 lives in return, for losing any one life of his side. Now it has been reduced to like 20 to 1. And this is because of the international pressure. And not from the Western Occidental states necessarily. No, it's from the popular opposition, which force their governments to state something, in opposition to Zionism. Now Biden, is obliged to back off of his initial 100% endorsement, of Israel's campaign against Gaza and Hamas. So now he has to say something, that is human, on behalf of the Palestinian, humane, on behalf of the Palestinian people, because of the popular pressure, and because, in particular, the pressure from the young Jewish opposition as well, which expose him for being a Zionist and not for opposing racism. So, yes, it is better now than it was before, and it's because of the opposition.
And just touching on the question whether you've been there and what was your experience like, if you have.
It's very difficult to get into Gaza. You need a permit, from the Zionist state, and you need a permit from Hamas as well to get into Gaza.
Okay.
So I have enough work to do in Nablus and around Nablus. And I let others. But for internationals to get into Gaza, it's very difficult. It's a bit better, for journalists. But even then, the big journalist agencies like Associated Press have to hire a local Palestinian in order to do the reporting, because, they can't get, international journalists to come in there.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, Doctor, for coming to the show, and it was really nice. And hopefully, we'll have a discussion again. Thanks a lot.
And I thank you.
آپ لوگوں نے ڈسکشن سنی ڈاکٹر ابراہیم وائسفیلڈ کی، اور میں چاہ رہا ہوں کہ ہم اس پہ تھوڑا سا، میں آپ کا خاص طور پہ حماس بھائی آپ کی اس میں انشاءاللہ کچھ تبصرہ لینا چاہ رہا ہوں.
اچھا،
سو آپ کی آبزرویشن کیا ہے؟ یعنی ابھی ہم نے جو خلاصہ اس کا پورا میں سمجھتا ہوں کچھ ورڈس کے اندر میں بیان کر دوں. ایک تو یہ کہ ان کے نزدیک زائنزم کو جوش جو پیپل سے ڈفرینشیٹ کرنا چاہیے. زائنسٹ اور ان کے بقول ڈاکٹر ابراہیم کے جو اینٹی زائنزم کا جو نیریٹو ہے وہ بہت زیادہ کامن اور پاپولر ہے جیوز میں. ہم مسلمانوں کے اندر یہ اتنا کامن نہیں ہے. وائی ڈو یو تھنک؟ یعنی ایک تو ان کی بات ہے کہ ایک ہمارا وٹ ڈو یو تھنک کہ مسلمان ان کو ڈفرینشیٹ نہیں کرتے زائنزم اور جوش پیپل میں، اس کی کیا ریزن ہے؟
اچھا، سب سے پہلے میں آپ کو ذرا یہ ہسٹری بتانا چاہوں گا کہ میرا ایک کانٹیکٹ کس طرح ہوا ڈاکٹر کے ساتھ. یہ تقریباً 10 سال پہلے کی بات ہے کہ آن لائن جو ہے، جب فلسطین کا ایشو تھا تو ہم آن لائن ہوتے تھے، ڈسکشن کرتے تھے، دیکھتے تھے. تو وہاں پر میرا فرسٹ ٹائم جو ہے نا، میں ایک ایسے گروپ میں تھا جس میں میں ریسرچ کرنا چاہ رہا تھا، دیکھنا چاہ رہا تھا جوش پیپل کے بارے میں کہ یہ کیا چکر ہے اسرائیل کے بارے میں. تو وہاں پر میری انٹریکشن ہوئی کچھ لوگوں سے جو کہ جوش تھے، ٹھیک ہے نا، اور انہوں نے یہ اینٹی زائنسٹ سلوگن لے کے بیٹھے ہوئے تھے. یعنی ان کا پورا گیٹ اپ جو ہے وہ ایک جوش پرسن کا تھا اور یہ تھا. اور اس کے باوجود نا، جب میں نے دیکھا کہ انہوں نے اس طرح کے سلوگنس پکڑے ہوئے ہیں، فلسطین کا فلیگ، فلسطین کا جھنڈا انہوں نے پکڑا ہوا ہے، اور یہ ساری چیزیں جب یہ میرے لیے ایک شوق تھا. میں نے کہا یہ کیا عجیب بات ہے. تو پھر وہاں پر جب میں نے آن لائن انٹریکٹ کیا فیس بک پہ، تو مجھے لوگوں نے کچھ نے رسپونڈ کیا، اور دے ور ویری ایگر ولنگ کہ ہماری وائس جو ہے نا یہاں پر ریپرزینٹ ہو ان ریگارڈس ٹو کہ یہاں پر ایسے لوگ بھی ہیں جو کہ یہودی ہیں لیکن وہ فلسطین کے حق میں بولتے ہیں اور اسرائیل کو وہ نہیں مانتے. اور ڈاکٹر ابراہیم جو ہے وہ صرف ایک گروپ میں سے ہیں جو کہ اینٹی زائنسٹ نیریٹو کے ہیں. آپ دیکھ سکتے ہیں کہ انہوں نے بتایا کہ ان کی جو بندس موومنٹ جو ہے وہ ایک سوشلسٹ موومنٹ ہے، سیکولر جوز کی ہے، ٹھیک ہے نا. اور جو دوسرے ہیں ان کے علاوہ آرتھوڈاکس ہیں جو کہ فلی ریلیجیس ہیں، ٹھیک ہے، اور وہ اپنے ٹیکسٹ کی بیسس پہ جسٹیفائی کرتے ہیں. جیسے نیوٹریکارٹا ایک گروپ ہے، ٹھیک ہے، ایک اور گروپ ہے اس کا نام ہے ٹرو تورا جوز، ٹھیک ہے، اور یہ زیادہ تر امریکہ میں پائے جاتے ہیں، ٹھیک ہے نا. دوسرا انہوں نے اس نیریٹو سے پھر ہمیں یہ انہوں نے ظاہر کیا کہ دیکھیں زائنزم جو ہے نا ایک پولیٹیکل آئیڈیالوجی ہے، اور اس کے پیچھے کچھ آپ کہہ لیں کہ پروٹسٹنٹ کرسچن ہیں ان کے بقول
جو کام کر رہے ہیں
اور اگر وہ شروع میں اگر کرسچن تھے تو کچھ نے کہا، کچھ نیریٹو دیتے ہیں کہ یہ اور سیکولر پاورز تھیں جن کا پولیٹیکل ریزنس کی وجہ سے جو ہے یہ ان کو لے کے آنا چاہتے تھے.
احمد بھائی، میں یہاں پہ آپ سے ایک سوال کرنا چاہتا ہوں. میں چاہ رہا ہوں آپ اس پہ تھوڑی سی اپنی رائے دیں. ہم مسلمانوں کے یہاں، یعنی اگر جس طریقے سے یہ بتا رہے ہیں ڈاکٹر ابراہیم، اگین یہ بڑی وہ چیزیں بیان کر رہے ہیں جو ظاہر ہے ان کا اپنا نیریٹو ہے. وی ڈو ناٹ نیڈ ٹو ایکچولی 100% ایگری ود ہم. میرا سوال یہ ہے کہ ہم مسلمان، ہمارا تو یہ نیریٹو، ہم تو فرق نہیں کرتے زائنسٹ میں اور یہودیوں میں، یعنی جو جوش پیپل، جو جوش کمیونٹی کی یہ بات کر رہے ہیں. میرا سوال یہ کہ کیا آپ کی یعنی ریسرچ کے مطابق کیا جو پیلسٹینین عربز ہیں، آپ کی انٹریکشن ہوئی ہوگی انگلینڈ میں اور دوسرے ممالک میں، کیا ان کا بھی وہ بھی ڈفرینشیٹ کرتے ہیں، یا وہ بھی عام کامن مسلم نیریٹو کی طرح وہ ان دونوں میں ڈفرینشیٹ نہیں کرتے اور ان کو ایک ہی سمجھتے ہیں؟
دیکھیں مغیرہ بھائی، اگر تو ہم تھیولوجیکل پوائنٹ آف ویو سے دیکھیں نا، عقیدے کے اسپیکٹ سے ایز بلیورز، تو there is no difference between someone who's a Zionist Jew and someone who's a Zionist. Difference in this, a Jew follows the ideology of Zionism. Obviously اگر ہم اس کو objectively دیکھیں گے تو ہم شاید کہیں گے کہ Zionist جو ہے وہ زیادہ برا ہے، کیونکہ وہ
ظلم اور
جو اس کا آئیڈیا ہے وہ گراؤنڈ ریالٹیز میں ظلم میں کریٹ ہوتا ہے، ٹھیک ہے. تو تھیولوجیکل پوائنٹ آف ویو سے، کیونکہ تھیولوجی میں تو صرف ہم مسلم نان مسلم ڈفرینشیشن ہوتی ہے. پھر اللہ تعالیٰ نے ہمیں نصارہ کے بارے میں، کرسچنس کے بارے میں بتایا، اور پھر یہودیوں کے بارے میں بتایا. تو وہ تھیولوجیکل اسپیکٹ تو ہمارا وہ کلیئر ہے، اس میں تو کوئی پرابلم نہیں ہے. جب آپ یہ پولیٹکس کے اندر آتے ہیں اور اس خاص طور پہ اس ایشو کے اندر پیلسٹینین اینڈ اسرائیلی کانفلکٹ جو ہے اس کے اندر آتے ہیں, تو پھر ہمیں ڈفرینشیٹ کرنا چاہیے. کیونکہ جو اینٹی زائنسٹ جوز, کرسچنز اور نان مسلمز ان جنرل ہیں, وہ ایک اس کانفلکٹ کا حل بھی ہو سکتے ہیں. وہ کیونکہ آواز اٹھا رہے ہیں آپریشن کے اگینسٹ, تو ہمیں ان کو ایک پولیٹیکل سٹینڈ پوائنٹ سے سپورٹ کرنے میں اتنا کوئی حرج نہیں ہونی چاہیے.
دیکھیں ایک اور چیز یہ ہے کہ انہی کی آوازوں کی وجہ سے اب دیکھیں یہ پہلے جو ہے پاپولر نیریٹو انہی کی ایفرٹس کی وجہ, یعنی یہ مکس ایفرٹس کی وجہ سے ہوا ہے. کیونکہ اب دیکھیں اگر آپ آن لائن دیکھیں نا, سب کے سامنے نا یہ نیوٹری کارٹا کا نام آ رہا ہے, ٹھیک ہے, کیونکہ یہ ایک قسم کے فیور میں یوز ہو رہا ہے, یعنی
کمینڈیبل ایفرٹس ہیں ان کے. دیکھیں میں نے جو ان سے سوال بھی کیا تھا نا کہ 2008 میں اور 2021 میں کیا فرق ہے. اگر کسی نے 2008 کے ایونٹس کو فالو کیا نا کلوزلی, تو وہ بہت بڑا ڈفرینس دیکھ سکتا ہے, بہت بڑا ڈفرینس دیکھ سکتا ہے کہ اسرائیل نے اس دفعہ جو کیا ہے اٹ از ناٹ ایون ہاف آف جو انہوں نے 2008 میں کیا تھا. پھر انہوں نے ایریل شرون کی مثال دی کہ وہ اس کا ذہن میں کیا فگرز ہوتے تھے کہ اگر ایک ہمارا یہودی مر رہا ہے یا ایک ہمارا اسرائیلی مر رہا ہے تو ہم 100 ان کے ماریں گے. اور یہ ہوتا تھا, یہ باقاعدہ ایسکیلیٹ کرتے تھے, جیسے مطلب ایک راکٹ آیا تو یہ لوگ پھر ایسکیلیٹ کر کے 100 سے زیادہ مارتے تھے. اب وہ سچویشن نہیں ہے. کیا وجہ اس کی کیوں نہیں ہے؟ اس ایکٹیویزم کی وجہ سے. اور ایک دفعہ پہلے بھی ہم نے بات کی تھی کہ یہ لابینگ جو ہے اور ایکٹیویزم جو ہے اس کا فرق پڑتا ہے, اس کا فائدہ ہوتا ہے.
اس کا مسلمانوں کو فائدہ ہے, جیسے یہ خود بھی کہہ رہے تھے نا کہ ہم جب نہیں
فلسطینیوں کو فائدہ ہے,
جب
آج آ کے مسلمانوں کو فلسطینیوں کو فائدہ ہی ہے ایونچولی.
جب ہم ہوتے ہیں ان کا, جیسے کہنا ڈاکٹر ابراہیم یہی کہہ رہے تھے نا کہ جب ہم ہوتے ہیں آگے جاتے ہیں تو وہ لائیو بلیٹس نہیں چلاتے, ربر بلیٹس پر آ جاتے ہیں. لیکن اگر ہم نہ ہوں تو وہ باقاعدہ لائیو بلیٹس.
کیا وجہ اس کی؟ کیونکہ انٹرنیشنل کمیونٹی کا کوئی بندہ اگر مرے گا تو یہ نیوز میں جائے گا, انٹرنیشنل نیوز میں جائے گا. پیلسٹینین کی نیوز کو انہوں نے کیپ کیا ہوا, ان کو تو کنٹرول کرتے ہیں.
مسلمانوں سے ان کو ویسے بھی اتنا خوف نہیں کہ مسلمان ان کے بارے میں جو بھی نیریٹو رکھیں.
مگر میں آپ کو بتاؤں یہ بھی جو ہے نا بات کہ وہ جیسے انہوں نے آپ کو ہمیں مثالیں بھی دی نا کہ ان کو بھی ربر بلٹ ماری اور ان کو بھی ایک کوئی کینسٹر لگا ان کے چیسٹ کے اندر. ایک لڑکی تھی جو بڑی پیلسٹینین ایکٹیوسٹ تھی, ریچل کوری اس کا نام تھا.
صحیح ہے.
اس کو انہوں نے میرا خیال بلڈوزر کے نیچے کر دیا تھا. تو یہ بھی نہیں ہے کہ وہ انٹرنیشنل کمیونٹی کو بالکل کچھ نہیں کہتے, کچھ کو تو انہوں نے قتل بھی کیا اور وہ بھی ہمارے پاس مثالیں ہیں. مگر میں آپ کو بتاؤں, میں ان کی باتیں سن رہا تھا نا تو مجھے نا قرآن کی ایک آیت یاد آئی. انہوں نے کہا, آپ نے خاص طور پہ جب پوچھا نا کہ یہ زائنسٹ کے پاس اتنی زیادہ پاور کیسے آئی کہ انہوں نے ورلڈ سٹیج کے اوپر ایک ملک نکال لیا اور انہوں نے گلوبل پالیٹکس کو ایک طرح سے چینج کر دیا. تو انہوں نے کہا کہ یہ ان کی اپنی آرگینک پاور نہیں ہے, ان کو برٹش نے سپورٹ کیا, ان کو فرینچ نے سپورٹ کیا, فرینچ نے نیوکلیئر ریئیکٹرز دیے ان کو, اور آج ان کو امریکہ سپورٹ کر رہا ہے. تو میرے ذہن میں سورہ آل عمران کی آیت تھی, ضربت علیہم الذلۃ اینما ثقفوا الا بحبل من اللہ وحبل من الناس, کہ اللہ تعالیٰ نے کہا کہ ان کو جو ہے نا ذلت اور رسوائی جو ہے ان کو دنیا میں ان کے اوپر آئی, سوائے اس کے جب کہ انہوں نے اللہ تعالیٰ کی مدد سے یا لوگوں کی مدد سے اس ذلت سے ہی نکل آئے. تو ابھی بھی حبل من الناس جو ہے نا
وہ قائم ہے, ابھی
قائم ہے, ورنہ ان اینڈ آف دیم سیلفز دے آر ویری ویک. ایک تو یہ بات. دوسری بات جو امپورٹنٹ ہے نا وہ, اور بہت امپورٹنٹ بات انہوں نے کی, کہ جو زائنسٹ نیریٹو کی جو اصل ہے نا اسی میں کوئی ہوا نہیں ہے. یعنی وہ کہتے ہیں یہ ہمارا پرومسڈ لینڈ ہے, یہ ہمارا پرومسڈ لینڈ ہے, ایز اے ریلیجیس نیشن دس ہیز بین پرومسڈ ٹو اس. انہوں نے کیا کہا؟ انہوں نے کہا نہیں, اس کا ریلیجن کے ساتھ تعلق نہیں ہے. اسپیشلی موسیٰ علیہ السلام جو تھے وہ جب فرعون سے اللہ تعالیٰ نے فرعون سے ان کو بچایا اور بنی اسرائیل کو بچایا, تو وہ سینائی ڈیزرٹ کے اندر
ان کو 40 سال تک, جی
وہ اس خطے میں تو تھے ہی نہیں. سینائی ڈیزرٹ آج جو ہے ایجپٹ کا حصہ ہے,
بالکل,
اور ڈیزرٹ ہے وہ. تو انہوں نے یہ چیز کلیئر کی اور بڑی اچھی کلیئر کی ہے کہ اس جو ان کا جو بیسس آف دیئر آرگیومنٹ ہے نا وہی فلاڈ ہے
کہ یہ ہمارا لینڈ نہیں ہے.
ہاں, لینڈ نہیں ہے. دیکھیں نا مسلمانوں کا کون سا لینڈ ہے؟
جی
پاکستان بھی مسلمانوں کا لینڈ ہے, جہاں پہ مسلمان رہ رہے ہیں ان کا لینڈ ہے. انہوں نے بھی یہی بات کی کہ جو ایسٹرن یورپین جوز تھے, اشکنازی جوز جن کو کہتے ہیں, اور اشکنازی جوز کو کافی زیادہ فیور کیا گیا اسرائیل وغیرہ کے اندر بھی. اشکنازی جوز جو تھے وہ چاہتے تھے کہ ادھر ہی رہیں, اور جو فار ایگزامپل اسپینش جوز تھے اسپین میں رہنا چاہتے تھے, ایتھوپین جوز ایتھوپیا میں رہنا چاہتے تھے, مگر ان کو پریشرائز کیا یا جو بھی ٹیکٹک یوز کی ہوگی اللہ تعالی عالم, تو وہ ان کو یہاں لے کے آئے. اور انہوں نے اس میں بتایا بھی کہ ہماری لینگویج بھی انہوں نے یہ ڈش کیسے ختم کی. تو یہ ان کا اچھا ان کے ساتھ گفتگو ہوئی, مجھے بھی سیکھنے کو ملا. اسپیشلی مجھے یہ نہیں پتا تھا کہ اسرائیلی جوز میں 43% بقول ان کے کہ پولز کہتے ہیں ہمیں کہ 43% آر اگینسٹ زائنزم. تو میرے ذہن میں یہ سوال آ رہا تھا, میں نے سوچا تھا ان کو پوچھوں گا کہ اگر اسرائیل ایک ڈیموکریسی ہے,
زائنزم کے انہوں نے کہا تھا کہ دے آر ان فیور اگینسٹ دس پیلسٹینین آکوپیشن. یہ ہے
وہ زائنزم ہی ہو گیا نا, کیونکہ زائنسٹ آکوپیشن کو برقرار رکھنا چاہتے ہیں نا, تو اگر وہ آکوپیشن کے خلاف ہوں گے تو زائنسٹ ایجنڈا کے خلاف ہوں گے.
مسئلہ جو ہے نا جو میرے ذہن میں ریزالو نہیں ہوتا, جس پہ میرا خیال ہے اس پہ مزید ڈسکشن یا غور کرنے کی ہمیں ضرورت ہے, وہ یہ ہے کہ ڈسپائٹ اتنی بڑی زبان ہے اور اتنا پاپولر نیریٹو یہ ہے, اگین دا کوشچن از کہ اس کا اتنا انفلوئنس نہیں ہے. کیوں اتنا انفلوئنس نہیں ہے, اس کا اتنا امپیکٹ نہیں ہے؟ آئی مین اکارڈنگ ٹو دیم دے ہیو انفراسٹرکچر پہ ان کا کنٹرول ہے, اکنامکس پہ ان کا کنٹرول ہے, لیکن جب اسٹارٹ ہوا تھا تب تو نہیں تھا نا. تو بقول ان کا نیریٹو جو ہے, ان کا نیریٹو تو یہ ہے کہ انہوں نے جو اپریشن تھی جو اس کو, اور اس میں اینٹی سیمیٹزم کو بھی انہوں نے یوز کیا اپنے حق میں,
ابھی بھی
اسی طریقے سے
ہولوکاسٹ کو بھی یوز کیا.
انہوں نے یوز کیا.
فنگلسٹین کی کتاب ہے دی ہولوکاسٹ انڈسٹری, اس کی کتاب کا تھیسس ہے نا وہ یہی ہے کہ انہوں نے ہولوکاسٹ کو یوز کیا ہے اسٹیٹ کی کریشن
کے لیے. سو اگین حماس پہ what do you think کہ currently do they still have that power? کیا آپ کے نزدیک do they still have that influence? کیا یہ ابھی اتنی جو ابھی 43% جیسے ان کا کلیم ہے 43% جو ہے وہ لوگ, اور اس طرح خاص طور پہ کہتے ہیں میجورٹی جیوز جو ہیں وہ اسرائیل سے زیادہ جو ہیں امریکہ اور دوسرے کنٹریز میں, اور وہ ان کے خلاف بول رہے ہیں فار ایگزامپل.
اچھا
what do you see the future?
اچھا میں اس بارے میں نا ڈاکٹر سے تھوڑا سا ڈس ایگری کروں گا. ڈاکٹر از سیمنگ اے لٹل مور آپٹمسٹک, ٹھیک ہے, آئی ڈونٹ نو وائی, لیکن مجھے یہ چیزیں ابھی اس طرح نظر نہیں آ رہی. مجھے لگ رہا ہے کہ ابھی بھی ان کے پاس زیادہ پاور ہے, ابھی بھی ان کے پاس زیادہ انفلوئنس ہے, ٹھیک ہے, اور کچھ اس طرح کی ورلڈ پالیٹکس میں کچھ بندے اکٹھے ہو رہے ہیں جو اپنی ویٹو کو یوز کر کے, ابھی بھی ویٹو انہوں نے یوز کی, اور وہ دوبارہ جو ہے وہ اس کو کنٹینیو رکھنے کے بائی فورس. اب جتنا کیونکہ انہیں یہ بلیک اینڈ وائٹ سسٹم ہوگا نا, اتنی زیادہ وہ وارفیئر اور فورس کی طرف آئے گی, ٹھیک ہے. اب اس کے دو آؤٹ کم ہو سکتے ہیں, آئدر ڈیزاسٹرس ہوگا کیونکہ وہ وارفیئر والا, یا پھر یہ ہوگا کہ پھر ایک آدھ ان کو گیو ان کرنا پڑے گا انٹرنیشنل پریشر کے, ہاں, اور وہ ایک سائڈ پہ لے لیں گے. ہمیں پتہ کہ جو لیفٹسٹ لبرل نیریٹو ہے وہ دراصل پیلسٹائن کے فیور میں ہے آج کل, اور وہ اس طرح یہ ہے کہ وہ ایونچولی میں بھی اس کو ان کو سپریس کرنے میں کامیاب ہو جائیں. لیکن ایون دو ڈاکٹر بہت آپٹمسٹ ہے, میں
I think because he is part of a revolutionary group, تو revolutionary group اگر optimistic نہیں ہوگا تو وہ کیسے سروائیو کریں گے اگر وہ pessimist ہو جائیں تو.
لیکن میں آپ کو بات بتاؤں, ان کا یوٹیوب چینل, ان کا یہ وہ چیزیں آپ دیکھیں بہت کم ویوز ہیں, ٹھیک ہے, اور ایون دو بہت سگنیفیکنٹ رہے ہیں آن گراؤنڈ یہ, ٹھیک ہے, لیکن آپ کہہ لیں کہ سوشل میڈیا پریزنس کے لحاظ سے, ہم تو صرف سوشل میڈیا پریزنس کے لحاظ سے بات کر سکتے ہیں, وہ اتنا زیادہ ان کا نہیں ہے.
اس طریقے سے تنویر کے بارے میں جو بات کر رہے تھے اس کے بارے میں بھی سوشل میڈیا پہ آپ کو کچھ نہیں ملتا, ان کی ایک ویب سائٹ ہے اس کے اوپر بھی زیادہ ڈیٹیلس نہیں ہے, بہت یہ نہیں پتہ چلتا کہ کمیونٹیز کون بیسکلی پیلسٹینین کمیونٹیز کلچر کو یہ کر رہے ہیں, اس میں کون لوگ ہیں, کون اس کو, مطلب زیادہ انفارمیشن اویلیبل نہیں ہے. بٹ اگین آئی تھنک لیٹس ہوپ فار دی بیسٹ انشاءاللہ.
اچھا ایک اور بات ابھی تک میں جس کے بارے میں کنفیوز ہوں, جہاں تک میرا پرائر انڈرسٹینڈنگ تھی نا, میری یہی تھی کہ جو زیادہ تر جوز ہیں وہ اسرائیل میں ہیں, ٹھیک ہے, اور زیادہ تر جو مطلب یعنی خود کئی ولنگلی جو ہے نا وہ دوسرے ملکوں سے وہ اسرائیل کے اندر آئے تھے, ٹھیک ہے.
ان کا نیریٹو یہ ہے کہ فورس کی یہ حالات کی وجہ سے,
نہیں, ان کا نیریٹو ٹھیک ہے, انہوں نے کہا کہ انہوں نے اس طرح کا انوائرمنٹ کریٹ کیا, سوشو پولیٹیکل انوائرمنٹ کیا گیا, پروپیگنڈا کیا جس کے تھرو آئے, اور وہ ٹھیک ہے بات, ٹھیک ہے, لیکن بس ان ریگارڈس ٹو کہ میجورٹی کدھر ہیں جوز, وہ میرے خیال سے وہ اسرائیل میں ہی ہیں, دیکھا جائے.
جی جزاک اللہ خیر. آئی تھنک لیٹس کنکلوڈ دا سیشن ہیئر. اللہ تعالیٰ ہم سب کو, ہم سب مسلمانوں کی حفاظت کرے. اللہ تعالیٰ ہم سب کو جو فتنے ہیں خاص طور پہ جنگ اور اس طریقے سے اوپریشن, ظلم اور زیادتی, اس سے بچائے. اللہ تعالیٰ ہمارے مسلمان بھائی فلسطینیوں کی مدد کرے, اور ہم سب دعا کرتے ہیں خاص طور پہ ان حالات میں, ان دنوں میں, کہ اللہ تعالیٰ ہمیں جو ہے مسلمانوں کو یونائٹ کرے تاکہ ہم مل کے جو ہے اس ظلم کے خلاف آواز اٹھا سکیں. تو جزاک اللہ خیر, انشاءاللہ ملتے ہیں. السلام علیکم ورحمۃ اللہ وبرکاتہ.